12:02 on the East Coast. I'm Roshni Rao, and I run the career office called PHutures at Hopkins that serves PhDs and postdocs across the board. We have engineers, chemists, biologists, social scientists, humanists, everybody. So since I began my position in January, we have been having these PhD chats or career conversations with both alumni and special guests from diverse career paths. So far for the humanities and social sciences, some of you have been here before. We've had career conversations in consulting, UX research, government. We've had guests from the NEH and the MLA in an attempt to sort of expand our knowledge of different paths and delve more into how to transition into those positions. So today, we are fortunate to have snagged not only someone who's a PhD in comparative literature and is the co-director of the PHutures Initiative at the Grad Center at SUNY. You've all read her bio. Not only has she navigated the career journey, but she's also someone who's written a whole book about it called Putting the Humanities PhD to Work, Thriving in and Beyond the Classroom, which I read over the weekend, and it's brilliant. Welcome, Katina. Thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you so much. I've really been looking forward to this conversation, and it feels wild still to see the book as an object in the world. So thanks for giving me a chance to talk about it with you all.
It is beautiful. And where can people find the book?
So it's available now from Duke University Press. There is a discount code that I can drop into the chat if you order directly from them, or you can get it, wherever you prefer to get books, at your local store, or if you want to get it digitally, you can get it on Amazon. But it's available everywhere now.
Okay, so yeah, I got it off of Amazon. So for the audience, please feel free to add your questions to the chat box as they arrive for Katina. But I can start getting the conversation going to warm us up. So Katina, I've read the book, and for those who haven't yet, can you give us a 3-line capsule version of what the book is about?
Sure. What I really wanted to do with the book was bring together different strands of conversation around doctoral education reform that I was hearing mostly happening in separate spaces from each other. So what I hope that the book does is bring together, really practical career advice and advice for people who are looking to reform programs in concrete and meaningful ways, with a broader discussion of the context, the landscape, the ways that we have come to be in a position where, careers in the academy are taking on a certain valence, and where people are needing to look for different kinds of options. I think that questions of equity and really creative scholarly reform need to be a part of the discussion of career development. And so that's what I hope the book does, is bring together those various strands.
Yeah, we do have Bethany from the Dean of Libraries and Professor of English at JMU that says, Katina Rogers deftly skewers narrowed notions of scholarly success and makes an urgent case for graduate education as a pathway to practical and meaningful work. So in the very few pages of your book, you say, and you sort of want to dispel this myth, if it's a myth, and you can clarify for us today, you say the humanities, the notion that humanities has always been and is currently in crisis. So as we stand today, 2020, is the humanities in crisis?
I think right now, everything is in crisis. It's, things have changed a lot, even just in the last couple of months. And so I think that the notion of crisis has become much more acute than it was at the time even that I was writing. I think one of the reasons that I wanted to push back on the rhetoric around crisis and the humanities in the book is that I see that rhetoric used in ways that I don't find particularly productive. I think that there are always ways to cast what's happening in humanities spaces as a crisis. But if something is always in crisis, then it becomes kind of meaningless. And so now, at a moment where we're grappling with COVID, we're grappling with massive economic downturn, like this is legitimately a crisis. And I think that what has come before are moments of inquiry, moments where we might want to redirect, moments where we might want to think about the value of what we're doing and why. But I don't think that those things constitute a crisis. I think they constitute part of the natural push and pull of how a cluster of fields define themselves and change over time.
Okay, absolutely. And I in the very beginning sort of few pages, you also talk about the limiting beliefs you had as a graduate student and perhaps limited knowledge about post-graduation careers in grad school. Can you talk to us a little bit about where you were and how that belief evolved over time?
Sure. I just really didn't know. I think, you know, I was someone who went into a PhD program without having a lot of family or social experience with others who had done the same thing. So I didn't have a lot of models to look to. I didn't really know, I just didn't know much about the structures. I didn't know anything about like the hidden curriculum or the tacit structures of academia. I knew that I loved being a student. I loved everything that I was learning as an undergrad. I wanted to go deeper, but I didn't really know what was beyond that. I joined a program at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I enrolled there because they gave me a financial aid package and a fellowship package that enabled me to treat it as a job. And so I went in really not knowing what the next steps were going to be. I think in some ways that that may have been, I wouldn't advise that. I think it's better to go in with more information and more grounding. And I think most grad students today go in with a much clearer sense of what lays ahead than what I did. But I do think that it was freeing in some ways because I did not go in with a strong sense that I absolutely wanted to become a tenure track faculty member, that this was the one and only path for me. I didn't have that sense going in. And in fact, when I started teaching from my first semester there and had, which is, I think this is true for many grad students today still, I had absolutely no training to teach. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know anything about effective pedagogy. And I found it really hard. There was a lot that I found to be really rewarding about teaching. But as someone who is an introvert and who has a tendency towards, you know, over preparing for that kind of thing, and who didn't have any background in what it looks like to structure a class effectively, I found it really, really draining. And so even at the moment where, well, for me, there was a turning point, which was I decided to move to New York City with my partner who had found a job here. And I think, you know, it's a personal thing and it's not something that's connected to my degree program, but I mention it because I think that there's too strong of a tendency for many people to feel like they have to minimize the other things that are going on in their lives. And that's just not the way that most other job searches work. It's natural to want to live in a certain place, to want to live where your partner lives, or to be able to take care of family in certain ways. That's really normal. And so for me, the move to New York came first, and then the opportunities followed from that and from that geographical constraint. But what I realized when I moved out here and I started temping actually with foundations and nonprofits was that there were a lot of things that I really liked doing and that I felt well suited for that did not necessarily involve classroom teaching. And so for me, that move was really a big transition, and just having some experiences in other types of work environments that ended up feeling like a good potential fit.
Yeah, and you do mention, and you take us through your journey in the book about, you know, the thought process and then how you did sort of temp and short-term jobs, and you were open to that. You did temp jobs, including one that you considered to be a very impactful experience at a science foundation, a Sloan Foundation. What was your career strategy at that point? Or did you have sort of a strategy at that point when you entered Sloan? You also mentioned how science and digital humanities intersected. Can you cover a little bit about how you accumulated what you then thought were inconsequential jobs and eventually leveraged it to create your narrative?
Yeah, I had no career strategy at that point. I was so grateful to have a job that paid a regular salary. I had no strategy. I was really glad, though, to have landed in a place that placed a high value on research and on scholarship, because even though I was coming from a very different background than almost everybody at the foundation, it was really clear that they had a value and an appreciation for the fact that I was finishing my dissertation. They knew what that meant and what that took, and they respected what that process involved. I also found it really interesting, and this was where I started realizing that maybe, you know, some type of career pathway where I could zoom out a little bit from specific content knowledge might be a good fit. I really enjoyed learning about some of the questions. I was working in partly in a scholarly communication office that had newly been developed there. And I really loved hearing about the questions that were happening in the sciences that were often overlapping but slightly different than what I was hearing in the humanities. It actually taught me a lot about some of the questions that were happening in the humanities and in libraries in particular that I hadn't been aware of as a graduate student. And this was when I really started to realize that there were things that, as I had been socialized into my own PhD program and into what that academic culture looked like, I had taken my particular experience to be the norm without realizing all of the constructs around it and all of the context around it. And I think that's what the position at Sloan allowed me to start seeing, was that architecture around and supporting academic departments and academic research that are hard to, it's hard to see behind the curtain, especially when you're a graduate student.
Right. And so you viewed it as sort of as a reframing, where you took all the experiences that you had and then turned it into just your narrative and your story. As part of that narrative and part of that story, you do a great job of acknowledging privilege. You said that despite the challenges, landing a job had been smoothed by privilege and luck for you, including having a PhD advisor who was supportive. So you do delve much deeper into this privilege aspect, and you do it from a data-driven approach when you consider sort of inclusion and systematic racism, sexism in academia. How do you envision, in a very broad picture way, structural changes within higher education, particularly in the humanities, to occur in, maybe we'll begin with, to ensure accessibility and equity to all, despite gender, race, sexuality, economic status, and you even address the pay gap between men and women. How do you go about, how do you envision this happening in the future? What should we be doing now?
Well, yeah. I mean, for one thing, just to acknowledge my own positionality with this group, I mean, I know that as a white woman coming into an academic administrative space, there's going to be lots of people who look like me. I know that. It feels comfortable for me to walk into those spaces, even despite, I think, the persistent sexism that is still a part of the academy. My expertise is not often called into question. It's expected for me to be there. And so, and I had a lot of people who were encouraging me along the way, not only my advisor, but I think a lot about the moments where someone said, have you ever considered a PhD program, or have you ever considered X, Y, or Z, and who gets those nudges, and who has to persist despite messages to the contrary. So I think about those kinds of things a lot. And I think when I think about access and inclusion in the academy, I think that a lot of, I don't know how we get there, but I think a lot of what we see now stems from metrics of success and concepts of success that are coded in certain ways that we have come to see in the academy as being neutral, but are actually racialized and gendered in ways that make it harder for some people to succeed than others. And I think we're seeing some changes happening already with graduate schools deciding not to take GRE scores, for instance, or not to require GRE scores, because we know all of the research shows that standardized tests are biased. They're not a good indicator of aptitude or potential or even persistence beyond the first year of graduate school. And so something that had been taken as a neutral barometer of whether students can cut it in grad school has been exposed to be, in fact, not neutral at all. And so I think, when we think about standardized tests, which seems so neutral in so many ways compared to things like letters of recommendation and all of the components that go into a tenure file or a PhD application, there are so many moments where the quest for rigor, the quest for excellence, is actually looking to a very particular type of scholarly success that is grounded in a predominantly white and male and privileged mode of inquiry. And so I think that one of the reasons it's been really hard to make significant headway on issues related to diversity and inclusion in the academy is because we're trying to layer that on top of a set of biased structures. And so by trying to hire more people of color into fields where they're underrepresented, or trying to recruit more students from underrepresented communities into PhD programs. That's one thing, but then when people arrive there and feel unsupported, or feel that they have not been set up to succeed, feel that their research is not appreciated or valued, then it's, you see people stepping away, and it's not a pipeline issue in that case, it's a bias issue. And so I think that, all of the different types of pipeline programs that we see are great and really necessary, but none of that is going to change norms unless we can also look at what are the sources of knowledge that we value within the academy. How have we come to see, the peer-reviewed article as the only measure of how valuable our research is? What are some ways that we might think differently about how our scholarship matters? And I think we're seeing this in a really strong way right now with COVID and with the Black Lives Matter protests that have come alongside, that existed prior, but have come alongside and really taken root at a moment of societal crisis. I think we really need people with humanities expertise helping others to make sense of what's going on right now and why. Why are we seeing this resurgence of activism in a moment of, what seems to be a medical crisis? How are those connected and why? And so I think that, the more we can have different sources of knowledge and different types of knowledge products understood as valuable and the reason why we pursue these kinds of studies, the more likely we are to see, I think, an expansion of who sees a future for themselves within the academy, and who pursues it and who excels in those spaces.
Right, and so as a career office, I got a lot of students all the time coming in and saying that they're afraid to tell their faculty advisors that they might want to expand out of academia. In fact, just this morning, Jennifer was on the tweet. We were discussing on Twitter how the use of LinkedIn is sort of frowned upon if you're not faculty and things like that. So when it comes to acceptance and inclusion of all sorts of careers, including obtaining support from leadership and faculty, what would be your piece of advice that you would give a student trying to have that conversation?
Students are it's hard. I have a lot of suggestions for faculty in that regard, but for students, it's tricky because you're often quite vulnerable, and yet there's also, collectively students can be powerful, but individually there's a lot of risk involved. And so I mentioned something that Kathleen Fitzpatrick said a few years ago, which is to do the risky thing, but make sure you have support, make sure someone has your back. And I think that advice is really sound, that you know your research project best, you know what you want to do. And I think staying true to those commitments, whether those are commitments of your community or things that inquiries that you've wanted to pursue for a long time, don't lose sight of that, but try to find somebody who, even if it's not your primary advisor, someone who's willing to go to bat for you when things get a little bit sticky. It's tough. And I think that the earlier these conversations start, the better. But again, it's a tricky question because right now students tend to be recruited because they're likely to succeed in that particular type of scholarly mode. And so it's not often that these conversations about careers start happening in the first or second year. They often don't happen until much later. So I think starting the conversations early, not feeling like you need to compromise, but also making sure that you have some source of support is really important.
You do mention taking an activist approach to individual success, and you said a large element of how you navigated this was creating your own luck. And creating your own luck was the quote that I'm in your book. So as a graduate student, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, what does creating your own luck also entail? I know you mentioned doing the risky thing. What else could we do? Where should I begin? And how do I begin doing that?
Yeah, that was something that Sarah Werner had said in a talk several years ago, and that really resonated with me because I think, while I do come to this position with a great deal of privilege, I also recognize the tendency, I think, especially maybe among women, to say, oh, I got really lucky, and to kind of dismiss our own efforts and the preparation and foundations that have gone into the pathways that we follow. And I don't want to diminish that for myself or for other people in the pathways that they're in. And so I think a lot about, I mean, my career path makes sense when I look backwards, but it made no sense to me as I was moving through it. I did not know what was coming next. And so for me, making my own luck meant making the best decision that I could make at a given moment, given the circumstances and constraints that I was under. Right. It meant saying yes to opportunities that I wasn't sure where they would lead, but they seemed interesting and I had the bandwidth to do it at that moment. And so I gave it a try, and then that could eventually become, you know, a networking opportunity that pans out down the road in future job prospects or something like that. And I think the thing that's really tricky about this idea of making your own luck is that I think that people often think of networking or of career searches as being very direct and transactional. And I think a lot of it is actually quite diffuse. And so this is the other reason why it's really important to start early, is that there are things that you don't know will become stepping stones that you're doing for whatever reason. It's some extra money on the side, or it's an interesting project or whatever. And you're doing that, you know, without knowing where that would lead. And then 5 years later, something emerges from it. But it's so that's the moment, that later fruition is where you realize that you have built your own pathway, but you didn't necessarily know how it would unfold, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. You in fact say that students just need to learn to practice translating or reframing the skills they already have in a language that resonates with prospective employers. I think that's what we try to do in our resume workshops, our LinkedIn workshops. You already have the written skills, the ability to dissect complex data, summarize, write. So what are some ways in which the students, particularly in the humanities, can reframe their work as academics to skills that an employer views valuable?
Sure. And I don't want to minimize how difficult it is to be looking for a job, especially right now. I mean, it's always hard to be looking for a job, whether an academic job or anything else. And right now, you know, it's a lot. So I don't want to minimize anybody's challenges that they're facing at this moment. I think one of the things that really struck me is I did a survey in 2012 of people who had advanced degrees in the humanities and who were working outside of the professoriate. And then I also conducted a survey of their employers. And the goal of these two surveys was to see how prepared people felt for their jobs when they started them, how much they felt like their degree program had directly prepared them versus things they had learned, you know, on the side. And then on the flip side, how, you know, get the employer's perspective on the same questions. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was that the people with humanities PhDs, by and large, did not find research to be an important part of the work that they were doing. But every single employer said that the research was something that set that particular person apart. And I think about that a lot, because I think that there are things that don't necessarily look the way we've been trained to think about research, and yet draw on all of those skills and use them really actively. So, you know, in many other workplaces, rather than research leading to a standalone article or something that just presents those findings, it might be used in service to helping the organization make a decision or advancing a particular agenda. And that research is absolutely essential, but it doesn't look the same. And so helping to, disaggregate those components and really think about teaching too. Like, there are so many things that go into teaching that set people up to be able to, you know, scope a project in an effective way, and think about timelines and persuasive speech, and how to scaffold material as people are learning more and more. And sometimes those classroom skills are just not brought into other contexts. So I think that those elements of translation are really important, and it can be empowering because it doesn't mean adding on new skills all the time. It doesn't mean, okay, do your PhD and then go learn a programming language. I think that a lot of those skills are things that can be learned quite effectively on the job. But the ways of thinking and the modes of doing the work those are much harder to teach, and that's what you really bring as a doctoral student or as someone with a master's degree in many of these positions.
Thank you, Jennifer, for putting the code in. She put the discount code in the book. We'll get to the questions in just a second. Before that, I wanted to, present a perspective you presented in the book, which was you have many perspectives. You speak from the perspective of the student, the administrator, the faculty, and also you say that when you create barriers for students to pursue diverse paths, the public is deprived of highly trained specialists who can help advocate for complex causes. And you say that particularly humanities PhDs bring that cultural understanding for public good and impact. And I thought that was an amazing sentence in that book, and it was really good to reframe sort of the advantage of having a humanities PhD in the public context. With that, let me ask a question from Natalie. Natalie says, a lot of us will graduate in a deeply uncertain economy, like in 2008. To what extent, if at all, should we be worried about making a bad first move out of grad school? By taking any available job that pays and has health insurance, are we closing the doors for the future?
That's such a good question, and one that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds. I don't think that there's a bad step. I think that anything that is right for you, especially in the given moment, is the right step for right now. Things are not permanent. What I have found, I think, especially being outside of faculty careers, is that movement and fluidity across types of positions and types of workplaces is much more common and much less fraught in basically every place besides universities. And so I think that this is a really important moment to be very clear with yourself about your needs, whether those are related to caregiving or geographical constraints again, or health insurance. Personally, I think that taking a position that offers health insurance is a better move in many cases than cobbling together adjunct teaching positions and going without those benefits, especially at a moment of public health crisis. So I think, on the flip side, if you have other means of accessing insurance, maybe you're partnered and you have insurance through your partner, then you have some other options available to you. But I think being aware of your individual circumstances and what serves you is really important. And this is also a way that I think that those questions of translation can be really valuable, because I mean, I thought the job that I got at Sloan, I think I mentioned this in the book, but I think one of the only reasons they interviewed me for this position was that I had had a part-time job as a grad student with a science organization. And I had only been hired for that because they needed someone who spoke French. I knew nothing at all about the scientific side of things. But so something that had been, just something that I had done because I needed some extra money while I was a student, ended up being something that I could position usefully for a particular job search. Now, that position would not have been useful for other types of job searches, but I think there's always ways to cast what you've done as laying the groundwork for something that you could do in the future. It's just sometimes hard to make that connection. And so I think what's really important is figure out the way that you can connect those dots yourself when you're going out for that next position. Don't leave it on the prospective employer to figure out how those things connect, but really show them what those connection points are. And we learn to write, and we learn to write well. So use that to your advantage in presenting yourself effectively. So yeah, I think there's no wrong steps right now.
No, that's sage advice. We have a question from Michelle who says, in your opinion, whose responsibility is it to find or provide career support to current PhD students and alums? My 2 cents is that the responsibility should be on the programs, departments, and colleges.
Yep, I absolutely agree. I think that this is not something that should be on the backs of students. I think that in some ways students can drive the conversation by expressing, their interests and their hopes and their goals career-wise, but that there needs to be much stronger support in a structural way from institutions and programs and individual mentors. I think that This is one of the big goals that I have in the book, is moving away from a sort of sense of individual decision making as being the real deciding factor in what types of careers people get, and really shifting to thinking about the systemic and structural questions that make this so difficult. And so I think there are really strong ethical responsibilities that programs have to their students. I think that programs should, they should be supporting their students financially. Students should be able to treat their years as a PhD student as a job. They should have health insurance. All of these things are things that I think fall within the ethical responsibilities of the program. Yeah, I agree with you.
Okay. Another question, and feel free to add questions in the chat box. A question is, I heard once from a researcher that it's easier to go from a research role to non-research role than to go into research from something else. If I leave research, do I run the risk of not getting back into it? Have you found this to be true?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that I think there's always a risk that, when you take a certain path, some doors close and some doors open. And I think that is the nature of things. However, I think that sometimes it's easy to see what doors might close, but harder to see what doors might open. So I don't necessarily think that the doors to research will close, but they might look different. I mean, even thinking about, I can speak from my own past, thinking about this book. This is not a book that I ever would have thought that I would be able to write. And as a grad student, I certainly wouldn't have predicted, that my research would shift towards institutions and systems as opposed to 20th century fiction in French and English. I don't do that type of work very much anymore. But I do find that I'm able to do quite a bit of research. It's just different. So I think, to step back from my own story, I do think I'm seeing greater permeability recently between faculty and non-faculty positions and research and other types of positions. I'm seeing people not only move out, but also move back in, which I find to be really encouraging. If I don't even like the way I'm talking about it, because I'm using in as kind of the default faculty position, which I think is part of the problem actually, but it's very easy to slip into those paradigms. But I do think that permeability is encouraging. And I think that, I hope that universities can also see the value of scholars who go into other roles and then return with different types of knowledge and applied knowledge that I think can really serve students and can serve research projects. I also just wanted to mention, this is only tangential to this question, but I'm coming from the City University of New York, which is a huge cluster of public institutions in New York City's 5 boroughs. There's 250,000 students who are seeking degrees, 250,000 more students who are just doing continuing education or a course at a time. It's massive, and it's really a part of the fabric of the city. It's also in the middle of a really significant funding crisis. And I think that this question of what is a PhD in the humanities for, what is graduate education for, part of this to me comes back to this question of who do we understand the public to be, and who are the publics that we want to serve through our research. And so this is also a way that I think that permeability is really useful, because I want to see people who are in city agencies and who are in, the tech industry, which is growing like crazy in New York. I want to see people with humanities backgrounds who are going into those spaces, who are able to talk about the implicit bias and the historical context of, why we should worry about artificial intelligence and surveillance that is happening more and more in classrooms right now, for instance. Especially with things shifting to online and COVID, we need people thinking about the unintended consequences of that. So I think that I hope that we will see a continuation of that permeability and maybe an expansion. So I hope it's not, something that closes the door, but it may require keeping your eyes open to things that are unexpected.
Right. So we have another question. What distinct opportunities or challenges do academic institutions have in supporting post-academic career paths versus independent, peer-driven organizations? And that question is part A. My part B would be, you did a study called Humanities Unbound, and I love the fact that everything in your book has stemmed from that data, and data doesn't lie. So in that data, you say 18% of graduate students are, only 18% are satisfied with the preparation they receive about careers beyond the classrooms. So in addition to sort of what opportunities and challenges do academic institutions have in supporting these career paths, what can career offices such as PHutures do more of, not just in programming, but in helping students very early on in their programs become more aware and prepared for various roles? So I'll start with the question in the audience, which was, what distinct opportunities or challenges do academic institutions have?
Sure, and by, maybe this person could clarify a little bit, by independent and peer-driven organizations, are you thinking about career support that would be happening in like nonprofits and corporations, or what are you thinking of in terms of independent and peer-driven organizations?
Yeah, and while they clarify, maybe we can talk about, are you turning your video on? Microphone on? Go ahead if you're turning your microphone on. I think maybe it was just someone turning their microphone on. So while they clarify, we can talk about, okay.
Oh,
yes. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, it can take different forms. Yeah, I was thinking, obviously there's some things happening in the private sector, but also, I'm familiar and involved with, like literally peer-driven, open organizations for post-academics. So it can take different forms. It can be community-led, or it can be, like private sector-led. Yeah.
Yeah.
I see. Okay, I was misunderstanding the question. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the challenges within academic institutions is that career support is often like literally and physically in a separate space than academic departments are. And so on one hand, I think that separation can be useful, especially if students feel like they need a neutral space to talk about career-related questions. And I think that, I think that separation is also problematic, because if students are already coming in with an expectation that the academic space is the space that matters and the space that is coded as being valuable, then even, going across campus or going to the other floor where the career services is located can sometimes feel like a big hurdle. And I do want to mention that the study was from 2012, and I think that a lot of work has happened even since then, and the people who were responding to the survey, many of them had completed their PhDs years before, when there were far fewer career services available to grad students. So I do think that services have improved a lot, but I think that maybe one of the toughest spaces for outreach for career services is to faculty. I think that, if there's a way to reach faculty and to convince academic programs to start talking about applied possibilities for the knowledge that they're developing and fostering, then there starts to feel like there's less of a separation between these two spaces. I do think that independent services and peer-to-peer services can be really, really valuable, and sometimes it's helpful to step outside of the institution for those types of support. But what I would really like to see is, less of a sharp line happening between academic and these para-academic spaces, whether they're support spaces or other in the university.
Yeah, let's take a question from Michael, and then I have a question about the term alt-ac. So Michael asks, so many positions outside of academia seem to define qualifying experience in such a narrow way that it usually means already having done the exact job for hundreds of years. How should grad students approach this problem when looking for different positions? Is it always about reframing our own experience, or are there any particular avenues that are more productive to pursue due to their greater openness? In your experience, have you seen certain kinds of pathways that are more receptive to the experience of humanities PhDs and others? What are some of the signs and signals organizations might give to suggest that they may value our experience?
Yeah, there's a lot to think about in that question. I think, first of all, thinking about the question of qualifying experience, I have found it really useful to think of job ads as aspirational documents. There's rarely a one-to-one match of exactly what someone thinks they want in a candidate and exactly you know, what they end up getting, the person that they end up getting who does a great job, it probably is not a perfect match. And so there's a technical side of the question, which is how do you make sure your CV doesn't get thrown out before it's reviewed if you don't necessarily have all of the exact qualifications that they describe. And I think in that space, reframing experience is really useful. You know, think really expansively about what management experience might be. You know, is there a way you can think about student management as, you know, it's not supervisory in the sense of employment, but it is supervisory in other ways. And what are some things that you can do to think about what you've done to meet those qualifications and still have room for growth, as opposed to feeling like if you check all the boxes, you're just going to be bored. And then as far as signs and signals that places might be receptive, I mean, I think that for me, at least, what has been really useful is to look for places that seem to be open to asking questions and open to their own uncertainties. I mean, I find that when a place is willing to say, these are the questions we want to explore and we don't know how we're going to get there, that's usually a sign that they're looking for someone who can push them, can help them to think differently. And I think that's what you really want is, you know, if you want to be able to apply the modes of working that you have used in your doctoral program, a lot of that is about being able to think and being able to, you know, go into a question without knowing what the end result is going to be. And so places that seem to show that openness, whether it's, you know, you might be able to tell through the kinds of projects that they're organizing or through the way that the job ad is crafted. It's hard to say exactly what can be the signal for that, but I think looking for that sort of intellectual openness and a spirit of curiosity and inquiry is often a signal that there's a real appreciation of intellectual and scholarly work. Roshni, would you agree with that? I'm sure you have a ton.
I was going to say that, you know, it's validation of the kind of advice I give all PhDs across the board, whether you're an engineer or you're a scientist. In fact, for me, my own journey as a scientist, when I was applying to jobs that didn't have anything to do with science, I highlighted or zoomed in on my positions, such as student org experience, management experience, things like that, and zoomed down. I became more of a generalist when it came to science. So it's the same advice. I think it applies to both or all sorts of fields, is depending on the job description, depending on the kind of qualities that the job or position is looking for, you want to be able to zoom in and zoom out accordingly to highlight or accentuate those parts of you. So for me, eventually my Futures director application was all student orgs expanded, and everything of my science was put into like analytical skills, problem solving ability. So those are what we call transferable skills. And Michael, when you asked this question about which companies, for example, we're having this hiring event that includes companies interested in hiring humanities, a consulting company has come in and put in an application to be part of this. And in that, they list specifically humanities folks as the kind of consultants that they're looking for the kinds of projects that they're working on. So just you know, being aware of what companies, and like Katina mentioned, they give you the signal. You have to delve more into looking at what projects they're working on in order to see how you can be a better fit for that. My question is about the term alt-ac. Twice already I've avoided using that word while reading out the other people's question. So for us in the career space, we have this ongoing debate about alt-ac being a very cringy word for us, because we want to be pushing for diverse careers, not alternative to something. You do a good job of explaining where that term came. And when I shared that with someone on LinkedIn, they were like all excited about understanding where that term originated from. So if we can call it alt-ac, or alt-ac feels a little diminishing to other careers, what is a good term to use? And I've been racking my brain for a long time about this. What's the other terms that we can use that signals inclusive careers in general?
I usually just say careers now. And I think that in some ways, you know, staying general like that and then talking about something that is clearly, you know, something besides a faculty position sort of forces the question of what are the things that we're assuming in that word. When, you know, what do people, you know, if you say careers without a modifier, what do people think you mean? How does that change when the conversation continues and you're clearly talking about a different type of workspace? I love the story of how the term came to develop, and Bethany Nowitzki, whose quote you read earlier, is one of my mentors, and she and Jason Rohde, who I also whose work I really admire. This was an in-joke between them on Twitter as a way to describe their own careers and kind of a nod to the old Usenet boards from when they were first getting into to using the internet. And I think that at the time that they started using it, it was a way of looking at it slant. It was a way of saying, at that point, people were tending to talk about faculty and non-faculty careers. And so, it's a little bit better than that, but more than just being a new term for it, it was a way of changing the angle and giving a different lens to the way that people were thinking about it. I think terms evolve all the time, and I think that alt-ac is not useful anymore. I think it stopped being useful as soon as alt-right started being a thing that was talked about, among other things. But I also think that the conversation has moved beyond that, which I think is really great. And I see Jennifer's comment in the chat. I don't want to diminish anybody who is continuing to gravitate towards alt-ac as a term, because I do really, I really find it to be something that's a productive way of thinking. But yeah, I just talk about careers and then see where the conversation goes from there.
Okay. You mentioned Bethany being a mentor to you, talking about mentorship. You also mentioned mentorship early on, is like you find a mentor who's outside of your primary academic mentor. In the book, you also say that there are solutions to accessible and equitable mentoring, one of which is the use of hashtags. And Jennifer, you were mentioned in the book as well, and you're here in the audience, about how hashtags and social networking can help make people more visible and sort of people feel more validated in their process of designing and exploring diverse career paths. Can you explain what you mean by equitable mentoring in the forms of social networking?
Sure. Certainly hashtags cannot replace human engagement with a really trusted mentor. I think there's things that really do need to happen in a one-to-one capacity. But I think we also know that mentorship can be really problematic in the academy, and it can be a source of support, but it can also be a source of toxicity. And if you are finding yourself in a space where your mentors are not providing the support that you need in a certain domain, I think Twitter is not exactly the space that it was 5 years ago, and I think it is wise to proceed with some caution. But it still continues to be a space where you can listen in on lots of different conversations. One of the hashtags that you might be referencing, Roshni, was Tacit PhD, which I just found to be fabulous. I mean, this is the kind of thing that I think, all of these elements of the hidden curriculum, new graduate students are coming into programs and having to find their way again and again and again, year after year. A new student comes in, they have to figure these things out for themselves. And maybe they have a mentor who helps them to navigate that, but maybe they don't. And so by aggregating these things in a hashtag and a conversation that's open to everyone, it can be really enlightening. I know for me, there were just so many things. Yeah, it was fantastic. There were so many things that I wish I had known as a graduate student. And not only did I not know as a graduate student, but I didn't know until 5 to 10 years after finishing my PhD. And that should not be the case. It doesn't make any sense for it to be so obscure. And yeah, I think it may have been Amy Morrison who got that started. But Jennifer, I think that you might have pulled everything together in a Storify, if I'm remembering correctly. Anyway, it was a great conversation. And I think that those uses of social media where, it's useful for promoting your own stuff and for having conversations one-to-one with people, but it can also be a really good way of being a fly on the wall for a little while, learning. For me, one thing that was really important was learning what are the main touch points in particular conversations. When I was trying to understand more about scholarly communications, I wanted to know, what are the questions that people find really interesting? What are the things that are making people pull their hair out? You can get a sense of that on Twitter. So I think that in in the absence of strong mentors, or if there's a particular need that is not being filled by one-to-one mentorship, I think that social networking can provide that in certain ways.
That's
I think it can also just be really useful to connect with people outside your institution. I mean, I think that that's the other thing, is that sometimes things become naturalized within a certain program or institutional space. And it can be really helpful to have someone else say, oh, wow, that is not at all what exams look like in my program. And then to know that maybe there's some room for pushing back on what it looks like in a particular program or institution.
Right, and so there's Twitter for discussions. There's Twitter for occasional job posts. I mean, you had many opportunities come through Twitter. You mentioned in the book, but I don't want to also discount the importance of professional networking sites like LinkedIn, where if I'm looking for a keyword PhD English, then all the jobs for a PhD English will show up in a curated manner on the LinkedIn jobs website. So in the last few minutes, please feel free to turn on your video, ask questions, or put it in the chat box, whatever you feel comfortable doing. I want to sort of read out the sentence in the book, and it's an impactful statement. I think you said, we need more people trained to understand and contextualize cultural, historical, linguistic valences of contemporary geopolitics. More people who know and are equipped to speak out against systemic racism. We need them in the classroom, but we also need them beyond. The impact of the humanities training would be far greater in many ways if, and you mentioned, universities did more. There was more mentorship, there was more opportunities for robust networking or networks. If we highlighted alumni in varied careers on websites or told stories. Speaking about storytelling, which is an element of navigating the job search process, interviews, resume, how important is storytelling, both from the perspective of highlighting other people's stories and telling our stories? How do we begin telling that story when we're navigating careers?
What a great question. I am reading right now a book called The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Singh. And in the prologue of the book, she says something like, in doing the research that she was doing, she needed to find a way to navigate without the handrails that stories provide. And I really love that image of stories as handrails, that no matter what field we're in, stories are something that we reach for to understand ourselves, to understand where we are, to make sense of where we're going. And I think that that's something that's especially powerful in humanities study, is we think about these stories and how they fit together, and it sometimes it can be hard to apply those same kinds of questions and those same kinds of discussions to our own stories. But I do think that stories are such a key way of the ways that humans navigate the world, and so being able to find the contours of your own story and think about those shapes. It may not tell you where it's going, but I think it can provide those handrails. Yeah. And just to be really clear too, in the quote that you read a second ago, I do think we need all of these things. And in order for these things to be possible, in order to have greater support for humanities PhDs, we need more public funding of higher education. This is, I think, not only true for public institutions. I think that the state of higher ed nationally is really highly dependent on a sense of the public's interest in higher ed. But I think the most concrete place where we see it is in state support for public institutions. It's been shrinking for decades. And if we want to see more robust programs, then that's the place to start.
Okay. At the end of the book, you outline 10 ways to begin for any sort of student looking to begin this journey of navigating careers, not just careers, meaningful careers, unexpected careers. For time, can you give us top 3 things that I, as a graduate student or a postdoc, should do right now? Actionable steps to take for my next sort of steps, starting from the moment that we're here right now. Where do I go from here?
Sure. A lot depends on where students are in their trajectories, but I think one thing that I think can be really valuable is career searches are really emotional processes, and trying to not strip away, but maybe set aside some of that emotion and approach it as a research project for a little while can be a really useful starting point. Thinking about, you know, how would you begin researching a new topic? Think about some of those same approaches for finding possible career avenues that you might not have expected. Don't worry if the first few jobs that you click on seem extremely boring, or you don't feel like you're qualified, or they're in the wrong state. Those things can all be really disheartening. But if you can just put that aside for a little bit and think about, okay, what are the patterns that I'm seeing in this? You know, I'm noticing that all these jobs that seem interesting to me have this cluster of keywords or seem to have this type of work involved. I think that that can help, and then it makes it easier to sort of refine where you're going. The breadth of this type of search is one of the things that I think can be really challenging compared to the more linear and direct mode of academic and faculty career searches. So that's one thing. I think approach the search with a spirit of inquiry and research and curiosity. I think just getting to know people is a really important part of it. And again, this connects with the idea of making your own luck and about networking and job searching not being a direct or really transactional thing, but just taking time to get to know people. And again, I think the curiosity that is such a deep part of humanistic inquiry can be a thing that really propels your own future search, not only for careers, but thinking about, you know, possible project collaborators. You just never know how things will unfold. So getting to know people, I think, is another great step. And then I think making sure that you have support. So what I was saying earlier about, you know, taking risks and standing up for yourself, but also making sure that someone has your back. Take a moment to think about who you consider to be your strongest mentors. Are those the same people who are on your dissertation committee? Sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. And I think that either way is okay. But, you know, put some time into cultivating those relationships. And for anyone who's on the call who might be a faculty member or an administrator, you know, think about the ways that you might be serving that role for students as well. I think mentorship is really tricky because it's not a part of the academic profession that tends to be valorized or rewarded in as concrete of ways as research is, for instance. But it's something that can really make a difference for an individual student. So yeah, I think those would be the three things I would say is approaching the job search with a spirit of research and curiosity, taking the time to get to know people, and making sure that you've got some solid support.
On that